In the unforgiving wilds of Montana, a rancher found a fevered girl, but he had no idea that she resurrected old ghosts and bound two families in blood and betrayal. Jeb Forrester rode through the golden Montana grasslands, the late afternoon sun painting the Bitterroot Mountains in molten amber. A dry breeze stirred the pines, carrying the scent of dust and juniper across the endless expanse. Jeb was a lean man of 40, weathered by the prairie sun and wind, his maroon bandana tied loosely around a neck that had seen both frost and fire. The creak of his saddle and the distant lowing of cattle were the only sounds in the empty expanse, a symphony of solitude that had become his constant companion through the years. He guided his bay gelding along the barbed wire fence that marked the edge of his claim, pausing at each corral gate to do routine checks. The wire sang in the wind, a metallic whisper that spoke of boundaries and belonging. His weathered hands, scarred from years of rope burns and cattle work, moved with practiced efficiency as he tested each post, each strand of wire that held his small world together. The gelding beneath him shifted restlessly, eager to return to the warmth of the stable as shadows began to lengthen across the grassland. Jeb's ranch, little more than a wooden cabin, a tack room, and a scattering of fences, stood lonely against the endless sky. The structures seemed to huddle together for warmth against the vast emptiness, their weathered wood silvered by countless seasons. Smoke curled from the stone chimney of the cabin as supper simmered over the stove inside, the promise of warmth and sustenance after another long day. The wooden porch gaped under the scars of many winters, its boards warped and split by the harsh Montana climate, but to Jeb it was home and always would be. He had been found as a baby after a skirmish on the trail, raised by old Captain Forrester and given their name, though he knew nothing of his birth parents. The captain had been a good man, stern but fair, teaching Jeb the ways of the frontier with calloused hands and patient words. All he knew of family was the life he'd made here, the bonds forged through shared hardship and mutual respect. The captain had died 3 winters past, leaving Jeb alone with his cattle and his memories, guardian of a legacy built on honor and hard work. Suddenly, a distant sound caught his attention, a weak, strangled cry barely louder than a coyote's whine. The sound drifted across the grassland like a ghost, barely audible above the whisper of wind through sage. Jeb stiffened, finger instinctively brushing the silver colt at his hip, the weapon's familiar weight a comfort against his palm. He listened, silence stretched like a held breath. Then again, from the scrub oak 100 yards ahead, that same faint, desperate wail pierced the evening air. It was human, and it pierced the lonely hush like a knife through silk. A chill ran down Jeb's spine even though the evening air was warm, carrying with it the scent of wild roses and distant rain. His horse's ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring as it caught some scent he couldn't detect. Gently coaxing the horse onward, he headed toward the sound, his heart hammering against his ribs with each step. The heavy sky burned red with sunset behind him, turning the edges of his cowboy hat and the folds of his duster into silhouettes against the dying light. He spurred his mare lightly, careful to make no sudden noises that might startle whatever lay ahead. The leather of his saddle creaked softly as he leaned forward, straining to hear any further sound. Rounding a broken clump of sagebrush, its twisted branches reaching toward the sky like gnarled fingers, Jeb dismounted and crept forward on foot. The cries grew louder and more pained with each step, raw and desperate in the gathering dusk. At the edge of a small wash, sunlight glinting off a granite outcrop like scattered diamonds, he spotted her. A slender Native American girl collapsed on the dry ground. Her tattered buckskin dress was stained with dark blood, the leather torn and mud-stained, and one leg lay at an impossible angle under her slight frame. A narrow pool of crimson wove through the scrub oak leaves, dark and thick in the fading light. The girl's long black hair knotted with bits of sage and cedar spilled over the rock like a dark river, and her copper skin was ashen and clammy with fever. Jeb was close enough to see her dark eyes flutter weakly open in misery, pupils dilated with pain and confusion. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps, each one a struggle against the grip of unconsciousness that threatened to claim her. Kaya or Aya, she whimpered in a tongue he didn't know, eyes glassy with fever that burned beneath her skin like wildfire. The words were soft, musical despite her pain, carrying the weight of ancient languages and forgotten stories. Jeb kept his Colt raised but relaxed a finger from the trigger, his instincts warring between caution and compassion. "Easy now," he said softly, his voice carrying the gentleness he used with spooked cattle. "I ain't gonna hurt you." The girl whimpered again, her lips cracked and bleeding, tongue darting out to wet them with what little moisture remained. She clutched at her side with trembling fingers, revealing a second wound that seeped blood through her makeshift bandages. He noticed a narrow arrowhead had been partially buried in her thigh, the wound dirty and raw, festering with infection. Wolf tracks circled not far off, as if a hungry pack had been drawn to the scent of blood and vulnerability. The prints were fresh, pressed deep into the soft earth, and Jeb's heart thudded as he realized the danger. Whoever did this could come back at any moment, whether man or beast, he didn't know. Without hesitation, he holstered the gun and dropped to his knees beside her, his weathered hands gentle as he assessed her injuries. "Stay with me," he murmured, ripping a strip from his flannel shirt with practiced efficiency. He bound the wound as best he could, pressing cloth and herbal poultice into the gash, his knowledge of field medicine learned from years of tending injured cattle and the occasional mishap. He poured a half shot of whiskey from his flask into her mouth, not much, just enough to dull the pain and cleanse the dirt from her system. The girl hissed as the liquor burned her lips, her body convulsing slightly from the shock. "Me I kaja," she mumbled, words too low to understand, her voice barely above a whisper. Jeb caught Burden Bear and Little Feather in her gasps, the names floating through the evening air like fragments of a half-remembered dream. The names flashed through his mind like ghosts of the prairie. Little Feather, Burden Bear, he didn't know what they meant, but something deep in his memory stirred, like embers glowing in cold ashes. The girl closed her eyes, exhausted by the effort of speaking, her breathing shallow but steady. Jeb lifted her gingerly and half-dragged her to where his horse waited patiently, the gelding's dark eyes watching with intelligent concern. He tied her wounded leg with rope from his saddle to splint it against bleeding, then slung her over the mare's back with a blanket, hoof by careful hoof. Despite her weakened cries, she was too weak to resist, her body limp as a rag doll. Shaking off the surreal fear prickling his spine like ice water, Jeb vaulted up after her. Balancing her on the bay's broad back, he wrapped the saddlebag over her and guided the horse downhill toward home, each step measured and careful. Behind him, the red sun vanished in a plume of dust, and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The gelding moved southward into darkness, and Jeb prayed the night would not bring more monsters from the shadows. Back at the cabin, Jeb laid the girl gently on his own cot, the rope springs creaking under her slight weight. By lantern light, he peeled off blood-soaked rags and rinsed away gore from her cuts with boiled spring water, the clear liquid running pink as it carried away the evidence of violence. He brewed a pot of sweetgrass tea, a remedy given to him years ago by a Lakota scout who had saved his life during a blizzard, and coaxed her to sip a few spoonfuls, tilting her head carefully to prevent choking. Her fever burned like a wildfire under her skin. Her flesh was clammy but now warmer as the tea began to draw poison from her system. The herbal mixture worked its ancient magic, soothing inflammation and fighting infection with the wisdom of generations. Jeb fed her carefully, murmuring reassurances he barely believed, his voice a constant thread of comfort in the lamplight darkness. Outside, coyotes howled their mournful song to the moon, their voices rising and falling in perfect harmony. The horse was stabled, the cattle secured behind sturdy fences. Nothing else stirred for miles except the wind through the pines and the distant hoot of an owl. All through the night Jeb sat propped in a rocking chair beside the girl's bed, the chair's familiar creak a metronome marking the passage of time. The lamplight cast dancing shadows on the log walls, creating a theater of flickering shapes that seemed to move with lives of their own. Every so often she moaned and tossed, her mind adrift in fever dreams that played across her features like clouds across the sky. Her hands clutched at invisible threats, her legs kicking weakly at phantom pursuers. Jeb's ears strained to catch her muttered words, leaning forward in his chair to better hear the fragments of her delirium. Bledsoe, Little Medicine, Kicking Horse, McAllister. Slurred syllables drifted through the quiet cabin like smoke from a dying fire. At the name McAllister, Jeb's heart sank like a stone in deep water. McAllister had been his father's old foreman on a Wyoming cattle drive, a man who'd vanished a decade ago after a barroom brawl that left 2 men dead and a saloon in ruins. He hadn't spoken that name in years, and certainly not aloud, the memories too painful to resurrect. Bledsoe, Little Medicine, Red Willow, the girl kept tossing, clutching his sleeve when startled by whatever demons haunted her dreams. Her grip was surprisingly strong for someone so weak, her fingers like talons digging into the fabric of his shirt. Jeb quietly scribbled each name on a scrap of paper by the lamp. Bledsoe Carter, Little Medicine, Kicking Horse River, Red Lodge. Each name seemed a shard of memory or legend Jeb had long forgotten, but together they formed a mystery he couldn't ignore, pieces of a puzzle that stretched back into the shadows of his past. By dawn, the fever had finally broken, leaving the girl pale and weak but breathing steadily. Talkie, as he would come to call her, lay calm, her dark hair spread across the pillow like a fan. Her breathing was steady now, no longer the labored gasps of the night before. Jeb saw that the bandages had soaked through again, the wound weeping clear fluid rather than the angry red of infection, a sign that the worst had passed. He quickly tore fresh cloth and rebandaged the cuts, dabbed antiseptic herbs on her fevered forehead, and held a cool cloth to her brow. When she opened her eyes, they were tired and dark but clear, no longer clouded by fever and pain. The improvement was remarkable, as if the poison that had threatened to claim her had been drawn out by the medicinal tea and careful tending. "Boy, pain, Tanwa," she whispered in broken English, clutching his hand with surprising strength. Jeb knew boy and pain, but Tanwa was new, a word that seemed to carry weight beyond its simple syllables. He gently wiped her hand with a damp cloth and said, "Easy, easy now, you're safe here, I'm Jeb." His voice was soft, careful not to startle her as she struggled to focus on his face. She studied him with those dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of knowledge and sorrow, and managed a strained smile that transformed her features. For a long moment they just looked at each other, two strangers bound by circumstance and compassion. He realized she knew only a few English words, her people's tongue filled in the gaps, a musical language that spoke of wind and water and ancient stories told around flickering fires. He cradled her hand as she drifted between dreams, her breathing gradually becoming more regular. Then she summoned her strength, drawing upon some inner reserve that had carried her through the night. "Jeb Forrester?" she asked, voice barely audible, each word carefully formed. Jeb's stomach tightened like a fist. Her accent was strange, not like any he'd heard in the mining camps or at the fort, carrying the rhythm of languages older than memory. "My pa, Forrester Wapiti," she murmured, pointing with trembling fingers toward the mountains that rose like sleeping giants beyond the cabin walls. Wapiti, the word echoed in his mind like a bell tolling in the distance. It was a Shawshone name for an elk, but something more than that, something that stirred memories buried deep in the recesses of his mind. When he gently repeated it in English, her face brightened like sunrise breaking over the peaks. "Mother," she breathed, the word clear as dawn, carrying with it a weight of longing and loss that made Jeb's heart ache. Suddenly understanding crashed over him like a wave. Wapiti, the name of a Shawshone woman from stories his father had told. A name Captain Forrester had once whispered long ago during those rare moments when whiskey loosened his tongue and old sorrows surfaced like fish rising to still water. Talkie closed her eyes, exhausted again by the effort of communication, her breaths coming slow and even. Jeb sat back in his chair, the notepad of fevered names clutched in his fist like a weapon against uncertainty. The puzzle was growing hazy in his head, pieces shifting and rearranging themselves into patterns he feared to recognize. Little by little, though, a terrifying realization began to dawn in his mind. The girl's murmured names and places were familiar to him. They tied to his own life and family far more than he ever expected. A chill ran through his bones, even as morning light spilled golden across the cabin floor. That morning, the old trapper Miles Jennings rode into the yard on his patched mare, the horse's coat dappled with age and hard living. Miles had helped Jeb on cattle drives for years, a steady presence whose knowledge of the frontier was exceeded only by his discretion. He paused at the porch, squinting at the girl on the cot with eyes that had seen too much of life's cruelties, his weathered face creased with concern. Jeb explained quietly what happened: the arrow, the fever, the whispering names that had haunted the night. Miles dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose bones had been broken and mended too many times, his eyes narrowing as he studied the girl's features. He had known Jeb's father and family for a lifetime, had ridden with Captain Forrester through Indian territory and cattle country, sharing dangers and sorrows that bound men together like brothers. After a long moment of silence, he spoke in a low, grave tone that carried the weight of buried secrets. "Bledsoe Carter and your pa, Captain Caleb Forrester, they were friends on the plains," he said, voice cracking slightly with emotion. "Word around the camp was your ma was a Shoshone woman named Wapiti, lady from Wind River. She died giving birth to you, Jeb, bleeding out in a cabin not much different from this one." Miles shook his head, his eyes distant with memory. "I remember Captain Forrester pulling me aside that day, telling me to take care of you. He said he took you in and left the newborn daughter to be raised by her mother's people, for some danger he never named. Said it was better that way, safer for both children if they were separated." The old man's voice dropped to a whisper. "That child, that's your sister." The words hit Jeb like a physical blow, driving the breath from his lungs. In an instant, everything clicked into place with the precision of a well-made lock. The fever-whispered names, the strange new language in her speech, the glint of his father's old necklace she wore around her throat like a talisman. Blood ran cold in Jeb's veins, ice water replacing the warm flow of life. The stranger on his cot was his own flesh and blood, his half-sister given away to a distant tribe like an unwanted burden. Anger and guilt surged together in his chest, a poisonous mixture that threatened to choke him. He had crept into this night to save her life, and instead had nearly sat by her bedside unknown, failing to see the truth that lay before him like tracks in fresh snow. "My sister," he whispered, scarcely daring to believe it, the words tasting strange on his tongue. Miles rested a gnarled hand on Jeb's shoulder, the gesture carrying years of friendship and understanding. "I'm sorry, son," the trapper said gently, "but there's no hiding it now. Truth has a way of surfacing like bones after a hard winter." Jeb's breathing was ragged, his chest tight with emotion. He walked outside, hands on his knees, staring at the mountains that had witnessed his entire life. His face burned not with sun but shame, the heat of recognition and regret. Memories pounded in his head like hammers on an anvil. Childhood tales of scalping parties and firefights, the years he'd feared and hated Indian raids. Now here was an innocent girl dying in his home, cared for by his own hand. In that moment he recognized the deep cruelty of what his family had done, the sin of abandonment that had shaped two lives. The betrayal cut deep not against him, but against his sister, left to grow up among strangers while he lived in ignorance of her existence. He clenched his fists and cursed softly under his breath, the words lost in the wind that swept down from the peaks. Against the cold ground he spat, as if purging the sin of his forebears, trying to cleanse himself of guilt that ran deeper than blood. The mountains watched in silence, their ancient faces carved by wind and weather, witnesses to human folly and the price of secrets kept too long. That evening, Jeb sat on the porch under a sky strewn with stars, the campfire crackling at his feet like a living thing. Beside him, wrapped in blankets on the cot, the girl Taki lay with an exhausted but serene face, her features peaceful in the firelight. By the dancing flames, he gently smoothed the hair back from her forehead, his touch gentle as a whisper. Taki opened her eyes and saw him, her dark pupils calm and full of recognition. The fever had burned away the confusion, leaving behind a clarity that seemed to pierce straight to his soul. In soft Shoshone, she said a single word, "Nida," the sound musical and warm, carrying the weight of kinship and forgiveness. Jeb felt tears sting his eyes, hot and unexpected. Brother, he whispered back in English, the word carrying years of longing he hadn't known existed. She smiled faintly, an expression that transformed her face and reminded him of someone he couldn't quite place, perhaps his father, or some echo of the mother he'd never known. From her pouch, she drew a small carved bone, a Shawshone charm worn smooth by countless hands, and held it out to him. Etched into its surface was his name, Jeb, in tiny script that spoke of patience and hope. He realized she had known of his existence, had perhaps carried this token for years, waiting for the day their paths would cross. His throat tightened with emotion. He could only give a choked nod, accepting the gift with trembling fingers. The bone was warm from her touch, carrying with it the weight of family and the promise of connection. Taki spoke slowly in English now, each word carefully chosen. "It is good, brother," she said, her voice soft as summer rain. "You are my brother. I am home." Jeb's heart ached with a mixture of joy and sorrow, the bittersweet recognition of what had been lost and what might yet be found. He took her hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of a life of hard work and survival, the strength that had carried her through the wilderness to find him. Together they watched embers glow red in the darkness as she told him in simple phrases of her childhood among the Shawshone, the lullabies sung by her mother Wapiti at firelight, the names of the stars and wind whispered by grandmothers whose faces were carved by wisdom and weather. She spoke of the hope that he might one day come for her, the dream that had sustained her through years of waiting. In turn, Jeb told her about his life on the ranch, the endless sky and wild herds, the loneliness and regret he carried like stones in his heart. He spoke of their father, the man who had raised him with stern kindness, and the guilt that now gnawed at him like a wolf at a bone. They sat long under those stars, two siblings at last reunited after years of silence, their words weaving a bridge across the chasm of separation. By dawn, the fever had finally left Taki's eyes, but with it went something more, the spark of life that had burned so brightly in the darkness. Jeb sat beside her cot, holding her hand as the first pale light crept through the window. She pressed his fingers with what little strength remained and smiled as the first sunbeams painted the cabin walls with gold. "I am home now," she whispered one last time, her voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through the pines. "Thank you, brother." With those words, Taki closed her eyes softly and drifted into the stillness that comes to all things, her breath growing shallow and then ceasing altogether. Jeb felt the grip of death pull at her hand, cold and final. He pressed his lips to her forehead and murmured, "Goodbye, sister," the words a prayer and a promise. A single tear fell onto her cheek as he wept for the life she'd never truly lived, for the years they'd lost to their father's well-meaning betrayal. The sun was high by the time Jeb rose, face streaked with grief and something deeper understanding of the weight of family and the price of secrets. In silence, he gathered her carefully in a blanket, his movements reverent as those of a priest handling sacred relics. Under the lone pine tree by the cabin, the only tree he had ever planted as a boy, now grown tall and strong, he dug a shallow grave. Earth turned under his spade, dark and red beneath the high sky, each shovelful a meditation on loss and love. The work was hard, the ground stubborn, but he welcomed the physical labor that kept his hands busy while his heart broke. Gently he laid Taki into the ground, covering her with soil and a scattering of river stones worn smooth by countless years of wind and water. From the braid of her hair, he plucked a single black strand, the silken fiber catching the light like spun shadow. As tears fell silently onto the fresh earth, he braided it into his own graying hair, the gesture both vow and remembrance, two lives now bound across the divide between the living and the dead. Above her tiny grave, Jeb fashioned a cross of old driftwood bleached white by sun and weather, and tucked a sprig of cedar and sweetgrass beneath it, an offering and a prayer from one lost soul to another. He stood a long time in silence, the vast Montana sky a dome of endless blue above him, witness to his sorrow and his resolve. The wind sang through the pine needles, a sound like distant voices carrying messages between worlds. "Rest easy, my sister," he whispered into the wind, his words carried away on currents of air that would touch the mountains and the valleys beyond. The prairie was quiet except for the faint rustle of sage and the distant cry of a hawk circling high above, a dark speck against the azure sky. In that serene stillness, he felt a weight lift from his soul even as grief settled in his heart like a stone. The burden of unknowing was gone, replaced by the clean pain of loss and the quiet satisfaction of duty fulfilled. At dusk he saddled his horse with the careful movements of ritual, each strap and buckle checked twice. Lantern in hand, Jeb looked one last time at Taki's resting place, the mound of earth already beginning to settle. "I will honor you," he vowed to the silent earth, his voice carrying across the grassland like a prayer. Then he rode out under the big sky, carrying both loss and love with him into the gathering darkness. The wind tugged at his coat and braided hair as the horizon glowed gold with the last light of day. Each hoofbeat was a promise. He would live on for her, telling her story under Montana's endless skies, carrying her memory like a flame in the darkness. And in the quiet hush of twilight, as the first stars appeared in the deepening sky, a cowboy and his lost sister passed on into the rugged light of dawn, bound by family and the solemn justice of the frontier. The land stretched endlessly before him, vast and unforgiving, but no longer empty, for now it held the grave of his sister, and with it the promise that some bonds transcend even death itself.